Snow fell like ash. The wind moved through the dead streets of Eid with the sound of a sigh, soft, endless, hollow. The war had stripped color from everything. Windows were boarded, chimneys cold, the air heavy with the odor of burned wood and unwashed bodies. Somewhere, a child coughed, the sound carried like a ghost through the emptiness. Anna de Vries trudged through the snow, her boots split at the seams, a bundle pressed against her chest. Inside the bundle, her 8-year-old son Peter shivered beneath layers of torn fabric. His breath was faint, his lips cracked blue. She whispered to him as she walked, though he was too weak to answer. "Just a little farther," she said. "There's still a chance at the church." The church wasn't for prayers anymore. It was where the starving gathered to barter scraps of food and news, rumors traded like gold. The Germans had taken everything, the livestock, the harvest, the warmth of certainty. What remained were the whispers of survival, the slow shrinking of bodies and hope. When Anna reached the square, she saw others moving like shadows between the drifts. An old man pulled a sled with a sack of tulip bulbs. A young mother knelt beside a frozen well, breaking ice with a brick. The bell tower above them stood mute, its great bronze heart long melted for bullets. Inside the church, Father Willem lit the last of the candles. His hands trembled as the flame caught. The walls, once painted with saints, were blackened with smoke. People huddled in pews, their eyes reflecting the weak light. Anna found a corner and wrapped her son tighter. "Any news?" she asked a man beside her. "None," he said, voice low. "The Allies are stuck beyond the river. The Germans guard every road." He shook his head. "They say it could be months before the food drops come." Anna nodded, though her mind refused to measure months. She was measuring hours now, how many more before Peter's heartbeat slowed for good. A door creaked open. The cold came in first, followed by Marique, the oldest woman in the village. She carried a wooden box in her arms, clutching it as if it were a child. "I found these," she said, setting it down. Inside were thin slices of dried turnip. The smell made heads lift instantly. Father Willem raised his hand. "We'll share," he said. "Everyone gets a piece." Anna waited her turn, watching as the old priest cut the turnip into uneven slivers. When her piece came, she broke it in two and pushed one half to her son's lips. His tongue touched it slowly, eyes fluttering open. "Is it bread?" he whispered. "No," she said, forcing a smile. "Better." For a while, the only sound was chewing, the fragile silence of people pretending the food was enough. When the candle burned low, the priest began to speak. "The Lord tests us," he said. "He does not abandon us." His words were steady, but his eyes were red. Anna wanted to believe him, but the frost creeping along the floorboard said otherwise. A loud knock cut through the stillness. The congregation froze. Every sound was dangerous in a village under German patrol. The priest motioned for quiet. The knock came again, 3 slow raps. "It's Jan," a man whispered, moving toward the door. He cracked it open. A blast of snow swirled in. A figure stumbled inside, a boy barely 16, his face white with cold. "They're searching again," Jan said, breathless. "The Germans are going house to house. They're looking for anyone hiding food." Fear rippled through the room. An old woman clutched her chest. Someone began to cry quietly. Father Willem spoke quickly. "Hide what you have. Stay silent if they come. God will shield us." But God had been silent all winter. The next hour passed like a held breath. Outside, boots crunched in the snow, voices barking orders in German. Anna felt Peter's hand grip hers weakly. She held him close, whispering, "Shoo, we're safe here." Through a crack in the door, she saw the soldiers move through the square. Their rifles glinted in the dim light, their dogs sniffing at the ground. One of them stopped near the church, listening. Anna's heart hammered so loud she was certain it would give them away. The soldier moved on. The sound of boots faded. When it was over, no one spoke for several minutes. Then Marique whispered, "Every time they leave, I think it's the last. And still they return." Father Willem nodded grimly. "Until the Allies cross the river." "And if they never do?" Anna asked. The question hung like smoke. No one answered. That night, Anna carried Peter home through the snow. Their house stood on the edge of the fields, one room, one stove, no fuel. She laid him on a straw mattress and wrapped him in her shawl. Then she searched through the cupboard for anything edible. One potato, soft and gray, rolled into her hand. She boiled it in snow water, sliced it into thin pieces, and fed him slowly. He looked at her with wide, frightened eyes. "Will the soldiers come again?" "Not tonight," she said. "Sleep now." When he closed his eyes, she sat by the window and stared at the dark horizon. Somewhere beyond it, she imagined there were still cities with lights, tables with food, laughter that didn't echo off ruined walls. But here, all she had was the whisper of wind and the faint creak of wood contracting in the cold. The days blurred together. People vanished, taken by hunger or the Germans. Anna buried 2 neighbors with her bare hands when the ground was too frozen to dig deep. The priest stopped ringing prayers. Even the crows had left. Then came the night the horizon burned. She was carrying a pail of ice when she saw it, orange flashes against the clouds, far to the west. The sound arrived moments later, low and distant, artillery. She stood frozen, heart pounding. Someone shouted from across the street, "They're bombing the roads. The Allies, they're close." Windows opened. People stepped into the snow, blinking against the sudden light of hope. For the first time in months, the sky wasn't just gray, it was alive. That night, no one slept. Fires glowed faintly in the fields, and the villagers gathered in whispers, half believing, half afraid to. Anna sat by the window, watching the distant flashes fade. She wanted to run toward them, to drag Peter into the light and scream that they were still here. But she didn't move. Hope was dangerous, it hurt to feel it. Morning brought silence again, but something had shifted. Even the air felt different, warmer, restless. In the church, Father Willem spoke softly, as if afraid of breaking the spell. "Maybe the Lord is moving his hand at last." Later that afternoon, Anna went to fetch water from the frozen stream. The sun hung weak behind the clouds, turning everything to a dull silver. As she reached the edge of the trees, she saw footprints, large, fresh, not made by any villager. They led toward the fields. Her breath caught. She crouched low, listening. Somewhere ahead, snow crunched under careful steps. Then she saw them, 3 figures moving through the mist, crouched low, rifles in hand. They wore strange helmets and uniforms, their coats torn and filthy. She ducked behind a tree, heart racing. For a moment she thought they were Germans. But then one of them turned, and she saw the patch on his shoulder, a white star. Americans. Her pulse thundered. She wanted to shout, but fear held her still. She watched as they paused near the hedgerow, scanning the horizon. One of them was bleeding from his leg. Another carried a radio strapped to his back, wires hanging loose. They looked exhausted, lost. The wind shifted, and one of them looked in her direction. She froze. Their eyes met for a single heartbeat. His face was young, tired, smeared with soot. He raised a gloved hand, not in threat, but warning, silence. Then he gestured to the others and they moved on, disappearing into the fog toward the village. Anna stood trembling, torn between terror and a wild, rising hope. She turned and ran, slipping on the ice, clutching her shawl tight. When she burst into the church, her breath came in gasps. "Father Willem," she said. "They're here." He frowned. "Who?" "Soldiers. Not Germans. Americans." For a long moment, no one spoke. The villagers stared, unsure whether to believe her. Then a sound drifted through the silence, boots, slow and cautious, crunching on snow. A metallic click. The unmistakable rhythm of trained movement. The door creaked open. A figure stepped into the light, rifle raised, face hidden by grime and shadow. Behind him came two more. No one moved. Then the first soldier lowered his weapon slightly. His voice was hoarse, accented but calm. "We're not your enemy." Anna felt her knees weaken. Around her, whispers rippled through the room. A child began to cry softly, and one of the soldiers, tall, broad-shouldered, eyes burning with exhaustion, reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled bar of chocolate. He held it out. The boy stared, not understanding. "It's all right," the soldier said, his voice breaking a little. "Take it." The priest stepped forward slowly, his hands raised. "God bless you," he murmured. The soldier looked around the ruined church, at the hollow faces, the shivering bodies. He nodded once. "We'll help if we can." Outside, the wind carried the faint echo of gunfire, distant, but closer than before. Anna felt the world tilt between fear and salvation. She looked at her son, still too weak to stand, and at the strangers who had crossed oceans to stand in this forgotten place. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to breathe. And in that fragile breath, hope returned, quiet, trembling, but alive. The wind clawed at their faces as they trudged through the frozen Dutch fields, half ghosts in uniforms that no longer kept the cold out. The snow was knee-deep, heavy with the weight of silence. Sergeant Jack Turner led the small column, 5 men left from what had once been a full platoon. Their boots were torn, their packs nearly empty, and their eyes carried the dull gleam of men who had seen too much. They hadn't spoken for an hour. Talking wasted breath, and breath was warmth. The war had taught them that every small thing mattered, a dry match, a single bullet, the sound of footsteps that weren't their own. Jack raised his hand and the group halted. The trees ahead were thin and skeletal, the kind that offered no real cover. He dropped to one knee and scanned the horizon through a cracked pair of binoculars. Nothing moved. Just white fields, broken fences, and the faint outline of a church steeple in the distance. "Town ahead," he said quietly. "Could be occupied." Private Eddie Morales, the medic, limped closer. His left boot was wrapped in a torn scarf, soaked through with blood. "You think they'll have food?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Jack didn't answer. Hope was a dangerous thing out here. "We move at dusk," he said instead. "Keep low. No lights." Behind them, Corporal Finch muttered something under his breath, a curse, maybe a prayer. He was the youngest of the group, barely 19, his helmet too large for his thin face. Beside him, old Reynolds, the machine gunner, gripped the handle of his weapon like a lifeline. They waited until the sun fell and the world turned the color of steel. Then they moved. The snow swallowed sound. Their shadows stretched long across the open field, flickering under the weak moonlight. By the time they reached the first houses, the village seemed already dead. Windows shattered, doors swinging open, no smoke from any chimney. Jack signaled for a halt and motioned toward a barn at the edge of the road. They entered through a broken wall. The smell hit them first, mold, rot, the faint sweetness of decay. Someone had died here not long ago. A small table stood in the corner, a child's toy half buried under dust. Jack crouched near the window, scanning the street. "Reynolds, cover the rear. Finch, see if there's anything edible." Eddie sank down against a wall, pulling off his boot. His foot was swollen and black at the edges. Jack looked over, grimacing. That frostbite's getting worse. Yeah, Eddie said, forcing a smile. But hey, I still got 9 toes. That's better than most. Jack almost smiled back. The kid had a way of finding humor in hell. Maybe that's what kept him alive this long. Finch returned carrying a rusted tin. Found this in the loft, he said. Inside were a few pieces of dried bread, hard as stone. Split it, Jack said. They ate in silence. The bread tasted like dust, but it was something. Outside, the wind rose, howling through the gaps in the boards. Somewhere far off, the faint thud of artillery echoed. When dawn broke, they moved again. Jack led them through the narrow streets, eyes sharp for any sign of life or movement. He didn't like how quiet it was. Villages didn't die this completely. Even the dead left signs of struggle, broken glass, footprints, blood. Here, there was only emptiness. They reached the church near midday. Its doors hung open, snow drifted across the floor, and the air smelled faintly of wax and cold ashes. Inside, shadows huddled in the pews, people, thin as skeletons, their eyes wide with fear. Jack froze. For a heartbeat, both sides just stared at each other. Then he lowered his rifle and raised one hand. "We're Americans," he said softly. "You're safe." The reaction was instant, gasps, whispers, tears. An old priest stepped forward, his hands trembling. "Americans," he repeated, as if the word itself were a miracle. Jack nodded. "We're passing through. We don't mean harm." A woman stepped from the shadows, holding a small boy against her chest. Her hair was tangled, her face pale but strong. "Please," she said in halting English. "Do you have food?" Jack looked at the boy. He was little more than skin and bones, his eyes too big for his face. Something inside Jack cracked quietly. He pulled a tin from his pack, a single can of beans, dented and cold, and handed it to her. The woman's hands shook as she took it. "Thank you," she whispered. "God bless you." Morales moved forward, pulling another small packet from his medic bag. "Chocolate," he said, handing it to the boy. The child stared, unsure what it was. Then, when the sweet touched his tongue, his eyes filled with tears. The priest crossed himself. "You have come at the end of all hope," he said. Jack looked around the church, at the hollow faces, the thin arms, the fear. "No," he said quietly. "Hope's still here." They spent the afternoon among the villagers, learning what had happened. The Germans had sealed off the area, burning the bridges, taking every scrap of food. The people had survived on tulip bulbs and melted snow. The Allies had bombed the nearby roads but hadn't crossed the river yet. Reynolds repaired a hole in the roof while Finch handed out the last of their rations. Morales treated the sick, though there wasn't much he could do with what he had. Jack sat with the woman, Anna, she said her name was, and listened as she spoke about the winter. Her husband had been taken months ago, accused of aiding the resistance. Her son had stopped walking last week. She said it all without crying, her voice steady like someone who had already run out of tears. When she finished, Jack said softly, "We'll help as long as we can. But we're cut off. Our unit's gone." She nodded, eyes glancing toward the window where snow still fell. "Then maybe you are meant to be here," she said. That night, they shared the church floor. The villagers huddled in corners, the soldiers lay beside their weapons. Outside, the cold deepened, and somewhere far away, thunder rolled, not from the sky, but from guns. Jack couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling and thought of his daughter back home. He carried her photo in his breast pocket, a small, worn picture of a girl with dark curls and a smile that still hurt to remember. He hadn't written in weeks. What would he tell her if he could? That he'd found a village full of dying people, and he couldn't even save himself? He sat up, rubbing his eyes. Anna was awake, sitting beside the altar, watching the snow through the broken window. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. She shook her head. "When I close my eyes, I see them," she said. "The ones who died. I try to forget their faces. But I can't." He nodded slowly. "No one really forgets. You just learn to live around the remembering." She turned to him. "Do you believe God watches all this?" Jack thought of the men he'd buried, of the screams that never left his dreams. "I think he does," he said finally. "But maybe he's just as tired as we are." A faint smile touched her lips. "Then I hope he rests soon." The next morning, they woke to a different sound, the distant growl of engines. German trucks. Jack's instincts kicked in instantly. He motioned for silence, checking his weapon. Through the broken door, he saw movement down the road, soldiers in gray coats, rifles slung, dogs on leashes. "Patrol," he whispered. "They're sweeping the area." Fear rippled through the villagers. Father Willem clutched his cross. "If they find you here, they'll kill us all." Jack looked at his men. Morales was already checking his pistol. Reynolds had the machine gun half-mounted near the pew. "We can't fight them head-on," Jack said. "We'll have to hide." He motioned for the civilians to move toward the basement beneath the church. It was small, damp, and smelled of earth, but it would do. Anna gathered the children, whispering to them not to make a sound. Jack stayed above with Reynolds and Finch, watching through the narrow crack in the door as the Germans came closer. There were at least 8 of them. Too many. The first soldier stopped near the church steps. He shouted something in German, gesturing to the others. Jack's hand tightened on his rifle. One wrong move and they'd be discovered. A dog barked. The sound tore through the air like a gunshot. The Germans turned toward the church. Jack's mind raced. If they stormed the building, the civilians would die. He glanced at Reynolds. The old gunner gave a slight nod, the kind that meant he understood exactly what was about to happen. "Wait for my signal," Jack whispered. The first German stepped through the doorway, rifle raised. Jack swung his weapon and fired once. The man dropped instantly. Chaos erupted, shouts, gunfire, glass shattering. Reynolds opened up with the machine gun, the sound deafening in the small space. Finch grabbed ammunition belts, feeding them through with trembling hands. "Keep them off the door," Jack shouted. The Germans returned fire, bullets splintering wood, sending clouds of dust into the air. Jack crawled to the side, firing through a shattered window. A round whined past his head and buried itself in the wall beside him. After what felt like forever, the shooting stopped. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of smoke. Jack waited, breath shallow, finger on the trigger. Then he heard it, engines fading away. The patrol had retreated, likely thinking the church held a larger force. He lowered his weapon slowly. Reynolds leaned against the wall, panting. Finch's hands shook as he reloaded. "Everyone alive?" Jack asked. "Yeah," Reynolds muttered. "For now." They went down to the basement. The villagers stared up at them, wide-eyed. Anna's son clung to her skirt. When she saw Jack, she whispered, "They're gone." "For now," he said. "But they'll be back." The priest crossed himself. "You brought death upon us." Jack met his eyes. "Death was already here, Father. We just bought you time." Outside, the sky had turned the color of smoke. Snow began to fall again, soft and steady. The gunfire still echoed faintly in Jack's ears. He looked at the faces around him, civilians too weak to run, his men too tired to fight, and knew what he had to do. "We stay," he said quietly. "Until they're safe." No one argued. There was nothing else to do. As night fell, the fire in the church flickered low. The soldiers shared what little ammunition remained. Anna sat beside her son, whispering a prayer in Dutch, her voice barely above a breath. Jack stood near the doorway, watching the horizon. Somewhere beyond that darkness, Allied lines were pushing forward. He just had to keep these people alive long enough for help to reach them. In the distance, a single flare rose into the sky, red against the clouds. Jack stared at it for a long moment. Then he turned to his men. "Get ready," he said. "This isn't over." The first shot came at dawn. A single crack split the silence, echoing through the frozen air. Then came another, closer. Snow leapt from the church wall as a bullet struck stone. Sergeant Jack Turner was on his feet before the sound faded. He ducked beneath a shattered window, peering into the gray morning. Shapes moved in the mist, German helmets glinting faintly between the skeletal trees. "They've found us," Reynolds muttered, gripping the handle of his machine gun. Jack didn't answer. He could already count at least a dozen enemy soldiers advancing across the square. More would follow. They'd come to finish what last night's patrol started. "Positions," Jack ordered quietly. "No one fires until they're close." The villagers stirred in the shadows of the church, fear spreading like smoke. Father Willem clutched his rosary, whispering prayers. Anna pulled her son closer, her eyes darting toward the windows. "They'll kill us," she whispered. Jack turned to her, voice calm but firm. "Not if we hold them off." She wanted to believe him, but she had seen too much death to trust words anymore. Still, she nodded and gathered the children near the basement hatch. Outside, boots crunched closer. The Germans were spreading out, using the rubble as cover. Jack felt the seconds stretch thin. He could hear his own heartbeat, steady and loud. Then the first grenade arced through the air. "Down," he shouted. It landed near the altar, rolled once, and exploded. The blast ripped through the silence, wood splintering, glass shattering, screams filling the air. Smoke swallowed the pews. Jack coughed, ears ringing. He crawled through the dust, dragging a wounded villager behind a wall. Reynolds opened up with the machine gun, the weapon's staccato roar drowning out the chaos. German shouts answered from the street. Bullets tore through the windows, showering the floor with glass. Finch scrambled beside Jack, feeding ammunition belts with trembling hands. "There's too many," he shouted. "There's always too many," Jack replied. "Keep firing." Morales knelt beside the wounded, blood staining his sleeves. He pressed his hand against a man's chest, eyes desperate. "I need more bandages." "There are none," someone cried. Anna ripped a strip from her shawl and handed it to him. "Use this." The church had become a fortress of desperation. Every creak, every scream, every echo of gunfire carved deeper into their nerves. Jack moved like a machine, firing, reloading, moving again. The air was thick with smoke and fear. Then, through the haze, he saw something that froze him. A door at the back of the church, a figure slipping out. One of the villagers. January. The boy who had first warned them of the patrols. "Where's he going?" Finch shouted. Jack's stomach tightened. "He's not running for safety," he said. "He's running for them." Jan's betrayal hit harder than any bullet. Desperation could twist even the faithful. Maybe he thought the Germans would spare him. Maybe he was just too afraid. It didn't matter. Moments later, the attack doubled in fury. The Germans knew their numbers now. Mortar shells fell on the square, shaking the walls. Dust poured from the rafters. One hit the bell tower, sending it crashing through the roof in a cloud of fire and ash. Morales was shouting again. "We can't hold this, Jack." Jack's voice was hoarse. "We don't need to hold it. Just buy time." "For what?" Finch cried. For them, Jack said, nodding toward the basement where Anna and the children hid. Every second we fight is a second they stay alive. The wall beside him exploded. He hit the floor hard, ringing ears filled with the whine of shrapnel. Blood smeared his cheek. Reynolds was still firing, the barrel of his gun glowing red. Then a sharp, sudden silence cut through the chaos, the kind that made the world feel hollow. Jack turned and saw Reynolds slumped over his weapon, eyes glassy. A hole bloomed dark across his chest. For a moment, everything inside Jack went still. Reynolds, who'd survived Normandy and Arnhem, gone in an instant. He reached out, closing the man's eyes. Rest easy, old man. He grabbed the machine gun and swung it toward the door just as the Germans charged. The weapon spat fire, cutting them down in a hail of bullets. Shells clinked against the floor. Jack barely felt his shoulder ache. He was just movement and noise now, nothing human left. Morales crawled beside him, blood on his hands that wasn't all from the wounded. We've got maybe 5 minutes before they breach, he said. Basement's too small for everyone. What's the plan? Jack looked toward Anna. She was crouched with her son, her eyes locked on him. That silent question again, can you save us? He swallowed hard. You take the civilians and get them out through the back wall, he said. There's a drain tunnel, it leads to the field. Morales shook his head. And you? Someone has to hold them here. Like hell, Morales snapped. You're not dying in this church, Jack. Jack's voice dropped low, steady. Eddie. You've got the kid. You've got the priest. They need you more than I do. Morales hesitated, then nodded once. He understood. He always had. Jack watched him gather the villagers, guiding them to the back. The priest whispered blessings as they went. Anna stopped beside Jack, eyes bright with tears. You'll come too, she said. He smiled faintly. Maybe later. She shook her head. You saved us. Let me save you. But he only handed her a pistol. For him, he said, glancing at her son. In case you need it. Her hand trembled as she took it. She looked at him one last time, then disappeared into the shadows. Jack turned back to the doorway. The Germans were closing in. The first climbed through a broken window, shouting. Jack fired. Another came from the side, throwing a grenade. He kicked it back out before it exploded. The church burned now, flames licking the walls, heat pushing back the cold. The air filled with smoke and ash and the sharp tang of gunpowder. It felt like the end of the world. Then, above the roar, a sudden scream. Morales. Jack spun around. The medic was down, blood spilling from his side, still shielding a child with his body. The boy was unhurt, but Morales's face had gone pale. Jack crawled to him, pulling him behind cover. Hold on, Jack said, pressing his hand against the wound. Eddie coughed, blood on his lips. Told you, 9 toes left. Don't you do this, Jack said. The medic's eyes unfocused. Tell her I kept my promise, he whispered. Tell her I came home. His hand slipped from Jack's grip. For a long moment, Jack just sat there, surrounded by fire and smoke and the bodies of the only family he had left. Then he rose, anger burning through the numbness. Outside, the thunder of artillery rolled across the fields. Not German. Allied. He stumbled to the doorway, blinking through the haze. The sky to the west glowed with flashes of light, American guns pounding the horizon. Reinforcements. The front was moving. The Germans hesitated, uncertain now. Jack seized the chance. He fired burst after burst until his weapon clicked empty. Then he threw it aside and grabbed Reynolds's machine gun, emptying the last belt. The flames climbed higher. The air turned red and gold. Smoke curled through the broken roof, carrying the sound of distant explosions. Jack's strength faltered. He dropped to one knee, breathing hard. Around him, the church that had sheltered prayers now burned like an altar to war. He heard voices, Anna's, faint but real, calling from somewhere beyond the walls. Jack! Jack, come! He forced himself to his feet, staggering toward the back. The heat was unbearable. The roof groaned, ready to collapse. He reached the tunnel entrance just as the cross above the altar crashed down behind him, sending a shower of sparks into the air. He crawled into the dark, lungs aching, vision dimming. Snow met him at the far end, a rush of cold that cut through the heat. He fell into it, gasping. Hands pulled him up. Anna's face swam into view, streaked with soot and tears. "You're alive," she said. "Not sure for how long," he rasped. In the distance, Allied artillery thundered again, closer now. German voices shouted retreat. The battle was turning. Jack looked back at the church. Flames devoured it, the steeple collapsing in a storm of sparks. For a moment, the cross glowed red against the sky before falling into the fire. He sank to his knees, exhausted. Around them, the surviving villagers huddled together. The priest murmured a prayer for the dead. Anna's son pressed the chocolate wrapper Morales had given him against his chest like a relic. Jack closed his eyes. The sound of the guns faded, replaced by the soft whisper of falling snow. He thought of the men he'd lost, the faces that would never see another dawn. Anna knelt beside him, touching his shoulder gently. "You saved us," she said. He shook his head. They did. Snow began to cover the smoldering ruins, hiding the scars for another day. In the distance, the rumble of tanks grew louder, the sound of liberation crawling closer through the cold. Jack turned toward the horizon, the faint light of morning breaking through the smoke. "It's over," he whispered, though he knew it wasn't. Not really. War never ended for those who remembered. The first rays of sun touched the burning church, and for one fragile heartbeat, it looked almost holy again. Then the roof gave way with a final roar, sending sparks into the pale winter sky. Jack stood unsteadily, leaning on his rifle. "Let's move," he said. "Before the next wave comes." Anna helped him walk, her hand steady against his arm. Behind them, the fire consumed the last of the night. Ahead, the snow stretched endless and silent. Somewhere beyond that horizon, the war raged on. But here, in this small corner of ruin, the living began to rise again. The war ended quietly for Eid. Not with the crack of rifles or the roar of engines, but with the hush that follows exhaustion, the silence of people who had survived too much to cheer. Snow still lay thick over the broken streets, covering the ruins like a burial shroud. Smoke rose from the remnants of the church, curling into the pale sky as if reluctant to leave. Jack Turner walked among the ashes, a ghost among ghosts. His uniform was torn, his face hollow, his steps unsteady. Every sound, every groan of wind, every crunch of frost beneath his boots, echoed louder than it should have. The air still smelled faintly of gunpowder and burned wood. Somewhere beneath the rubble, the names of the dead whispered through the silence. He found Anna near the well, wrapping her son in a blanket that was too thin for the cold. Her hands trembled, but she kept smiling for the boy's sake. When she saw Jack, her expression softened, though there was something different in her eyes, something he recognized all too well. The look of someone who had seen death and refused to let it take her heart. "You shouldn't be walking," she said, her voice low, almost scolding. Jack managed a faint smile. "If I sit still, I'll start thinking." "That's worse." She handed him a cup of water, and for a moment, they stood in silence, watching a pair of Allied jeeps roll slowly into the square. The soldiers inside waved as they passed, faces young and tired, their laughter brittle with relief. Behind them came supply trucks, cans of food, blankets, medical kits, all marked with the white star of salvation. The villagers began to gather, drawn by the sight like moths to light. Children stumbled forward, eyes wide, too weak to run but desperate to believe the war was truly over. One of the American soldiers, a corporal with freckles and a kind smile, knelt to hand out chocolate bars. The children swarmed him, laughter bubbling up for the first time in months. Jack watched from a distance, hands buried in his coat. "They're just kids," he murmured. "But they've lived through hell." Anna followed his gaze. "So have you." He shook his head slowly. "I just walked through it. They grew up in it." Father Willem joined them, his cassock torn but clean. He carried a small wooden cross, salvaged from the wreck of the church. "The Lord provides," he said softly. "Even in ruin." Jack glanced toward the remains of the steeple, blackened against the snow. "He's got a dark sense of humor." The priest smiled sadly. "Perhaps. But you're alive. That's miracle enough." They spent the day clearing rubble, stacking what could be saved, burying what couldn't. Every few hours, the sound of distant artillery rolled across the fields, the last battles retreating eastward. Liberation was spreading like dawn, one shattered village at a time. By afternoon, the air grew warmer, and sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time in weeks. Jack sat on a fallen beam, smoking a cigarette Morales had left in his pack. He hadn't meant to think about him, but the moment he did, it hit like a punch. Morales laughing by the fire. Reynolds complaining about rations. Finch humming old jazz tunes. All gone. Anna sat beside him, her son asleep in her lap. "You lost friends," she said quietly. He nodded. "Too many. Will you go home now?" Jack stared at the horizon, where the road wound through snow-covered fields toward the west. "Home," he repeated, as if testing the word. "I don't even know where that is anymore." Anna studied him for a long moment. "Maybe home isn't a place," she said. "Maybe it's the people who remind you you're still human." He looked at her then, really looked. The smudges of soot on her cheek, the strands of hair that refused to stay tucked beneath her scarf, the tired grace in her movements. For a heartbeat, something warm stirred beneath the numbness. Before he could answer, a convoy of trucks pulled into the square. Officers climbed down, speaking briskly with the villagers. Jack recognized the insignia of the 101st Airborne. Reinforcements. The war machine was already moving on, leaving the ruins to those who would rebuild them. A lieutenant approached Jack, clipboard in hand. "You Sergeant Turner?" "Was," Jack said. The lieutenant glanced at his uniform, noting the grime and blood. "You're one of the survivors from the Eid siege. Hell of a stand. You've got a citation coming your way." Jack didn't respond. The word citation felt meaningless here, surrounded by graves and smoke. The lieutenant cleared his throat. "You'll be transported back to Nijmegen tomorrow. Medical units taking over here." Jack nodded faintly. "I'll be ready." When the officer left, Anna turned to him, alarm flickering in her eyes. "You're leaving?" He hesitated. "Orders." Her gaze dropped to the snow. "We all have our orders, I suppose." That night, the village gathered around a fire in the square. Someone had found a violin, half broken but still capable of song. The priest said a prayer for the fallen, and the villagers lit candles, one for every name they could remember. Jack stood apart, watching the flames dance. The light flickered across the faces of the survivors, old men, widows, children too thin to stand long. The cost of survival lay written in every line. Anna joined him, holding 2 candles. She handed one to him. "For them," she said. He hesitated, then took it. Together, they placed the candles in the snow. The flames trembled, small but stubborn. When the firelight touched her face, he saw something fragile but fierce in her expression, a determination that went beyond grief. "Tomorrow," she said, "we start rebuilding." Jack smiled faintly. "That's the hardest part." She met his eyes. "No. The hardest part was surviving. The rest is just living." For the first time in months, he almost believed her. The next morning came clear and bright, the snow glistening under a soft sun. Trucks idled in the square, engines humming. Jack stood with his pack slung over his shoulder, the priest and Anna beside him. Her son clutched the chocolate wrapper still, edges worn but carefully folded. "You could stay," Anna said. "Help us rebuild. There's land, and people who'd be glad for another pair of hands." Jack looked toward the horizon again. The sound of birds was returning, faint but real. "If I stay, I'll bring the war with me," he said. "It follows us, even when we walk away." She took his hand. "Then leave it here." He looked down at their joined hands, the warmth of her touch grounding him more than he expected. "Maybe someday," he said softly. A horn blared. The truck was ready. Anna stepped back, her smile trembling. "God go with you, Jack Turner." He climbed onto the truck bed and turned as it rumbled to life. The villagers waved. The boy lifted his chocolate wrapper like a flag. Jack raised his hand in return. As the truck rolled down the road, he watched the village grow smaller, until it was just a cluster of smoke and snow against the horizon. The church ruins were still visible, its charred steeple pointing toward the sky like a reminder of what was lost and what endured. Miles later, as they crossed the bridge out of Eid, the sun broke fully over the land. The light poured across the fields, washing everything in gold. Jack closed his eyes, feeling it on his face, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a spotlight from an explosion. It felt like morning. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small object, a blood-stained dog tag belonging to Morales. He rubbed the metal between his fingers, then slipped it into his pocket again. "You made it, buddy," he murmured. "We all did, somehow." The soldier beside him glanced over. "Say something?" Jack shook his head. "Just talking to ghosts." They rode in silence for a long while, passing through villages where children waved and church bells rang for the first time in years. Each sound felt like a heartbeat returning to the world. When they stopped for fuel near a crossroads, Jack climbed down and walked a little way off, toward a small field where the snow had melted to reveal dark, fertile earth. He crouched, scooping a handful of soil, letting it fall slowly through his fingers. War had burned the land, but underneath, life waited. Always waiting. As he straightened, he noticed a small patch of wildflowers pushing through the frost. They trembled in the wind, fragile and bright against the gray. He smiled, the first real smile in months. "You stubborn little things," he whispered. The truck horn called him back. He walked slowly toward it, each step lighter than the last. Behind him, the bells of Eid rang faintly across the hills. Not in mourning this time, but in defiance. And as the convoy rolled on toward the horizon, Jack Turner didn't look back again. He didn't have to. The village, the people, the memory, they would live inside him, louder than any explosion, softer than any prayer. Years later, when the war was just stories in books and medals on forgotten uniforms, people would come to Eid and see a rebuilt church. They would hear how, in the darkest winter, strangers fought and bled to save starving children. They would lay flowers on nameless graves and whisper the names that time tried to erase. And somewhere in that crowd, a grown boy would tell his own son, "An American soldier gave me chocolate when I thought I'd die. He taught me that kindness can survive war." The wind would pass over the fields again, carrying with it the faint echo of that terrible, sacred silence, the winter when humanity nearly broke, and somehow, refused to. For Jack Turner, for Anna, for the lost platoon, and for every child who lived because they stood their ground, the dawn after the storm was not just peace. It was proof that even in the ruins of war, life remembers how to begin again.